Well, I'm not in favor of returning to the Articles of Confederation. The Bill of Federalism that you reference actually dealt with a lot of individual rights, not just states' rights. But in fact, what we did when we passed the 14th Amendment was we put a federal check on state power, which was essential. In fact, I wouldn't be in favor of the Constitution if it didn't have a 14th Amendment. But what we really lack is a reciprocal state check on federal power, so it basically just equalizes the playing field.
No, we do have that check. It is the fact that we elect members to the House of Representatives and the Senate.
All right, welcome back to part 2 of this episode of Modern Times with Cal and Mike.
Well, Spitzer there at the end of that clip, he seems to think that the representatives that we elect are is the check on federal power, but
yeah,
this isn't exactly the way it's always been, and this is precisely Barnett's point here that I think Spitzer's missing here.
Yeah, he's basically saying that the House of Representatives, and he even mentioned the Senate there briefly, would be a good check on federal power. And as we mentioned before, the Senate used to be elected by the state legislatures, and that was a way for the state governments to check the power of the federal government, not necessarily the people, but to try to
The House of Representatives was the people's way, and the Senate was the state's way, in a sense.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. You know, probably would be a good idea for us to go into the history behind the Senate and the House of Representatives. Hopefully those of you who are U.S. citizens know this story. I think it's pretty important, but our public schooling system tends to be lacking in many ways, and this happens to be one of them in American history and government. Anyway.
We'll recount it for you just to make sure everybody's memory is fresh on that.
All right. So our bicameral legislature, that's Congress, basically became 2 houses as a result of when they were working on drafting the Constitution. The original idea was a House of Representatives, or one big legislative body, and the issue with that is that if you required certain states, let's see, I think at the time New York, Pennsylvania, these other states were larger.
Yeah, Virginia.
And smaller states like Rhode Island were upset because these larger states would have gotten more representatives in the legislature, the way they had everything kind of set up.
So they could see this problem of this kind of tyranny of the majority going on here, and they wanted their own voice in the federal legislature.
The small states did, yeah. And then you have the other opposite end of that spectrum is you have a fixed number of representatives from each state. So that gives small states disproportionate representation.
Right, if they were represented all the same like they are in the Senate.
Right, so what they did is they combined both of those concepts, and the senators were elected by the states. And the Senate generally has been the moderating, the more moderate house, the mediating factor there in Congress to kind of slow things down a little bit.
Right, and make sure that we think them through before we take any action. But that's kind of been slowed down since the 17th, or not slowed down, it's actually been
sped up.
Sped up. There's been less of they've been less of a mediating force since the 17th Amendment, which of course gave
people
citizens
the right to vote
rather than the state legislatures the power to elect their senators.
So I mean, the issue with that is that, as I said before, the states would elect their legislators, or sorry, their senators. They are legislators, but more specifically, they're senators. And now that they can't do that, they don't have a direct voice in Congress in the way things happen. And that's one of the consequences of the 17th Amendment. So I think that this bill that they're talking about, again, helps to allow people in the states to try to, I don't want to say fight back against the federal government, but to allow a check. And that's a way for them to do that.
So
now that
I think that's the point that Spitzer was missing.
Yeah, he was a little confused about that. He was under the impression that there's always been the same check, I think, and he didn't realize that's how everything was set up.
Yeah. Speaking of other things that he didn't realize, why don't we check out the next clip we've got here.
But I want to come back to the two key provisions here. States can get together and override a congressional enactment, and you want to take away the power of the federal government to tax, which, as we all know, for better or for worse, is the income tax, which is the critical provision. And you take those away, the capacity of the federal government to lead us in a coherent way disappears.
Well, that proposal, which was one of 10 proposals I put together on Forbes.com, is not on the table today. But what that proposal did allow for was a national sales tax. So it wasn't no tax at all. It was no income tax.
But let's come back just to the repeal.
Nobody's debating that today.
All right, so as you can see from that clip, Spitzer is, say, very defensive about the income tax. I'm sure he wants more of his income taken too.
Probably.
He probably makes so
I'm
much
sure.
money it doesn't affect him. He pulls up his Mercedes every day.
Yeah.
While I'm stuck driving my Ford.
I wonder if he's still getting money from being governor of New York or just from his CNN job.
Beats me. Probably makes enough money at CNN.
Anyway.
Anyway, sorry.
The income tax actually hasn't been around since for the entire duration of our nation's history. It's actually less than half the time.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow, without an income tax, the federal government was actually able to fund itself.
Yeah, how did that work?
Imagine that. Do you have any idea how that could have been, Mike?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know. Tariffs?
Tariffs, import
Every
taxes.
country does that, don't they?
Yeah. In fact, that was a primary source of revenue in our country for about a little over 100 years, the whole 1800s.
They can always tax us on the things we buy. I buy stuff on the internet, so I don't have to pay taxes. But anyway, it probably equals out with shipping, but it just makes me feel better. Anyway, and then you have corporate tax, capital gains, estate tax, pretty much anything that, if there's money changing hands, the government wants a part in it. So.
Right. I mean, an income tax isn't, especially since in this case, Barnett would propose to replace it with a sales tax. Anyway,
The way I see it is if the employment rate's still pretty bad, they're losing that income tax even more. I mean, the more the employment rate goes down, the more insignificant.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they.
Right?
Yeah,
everybody's making a little bit less money or making money under the table.
They might not be so unhappy with letting it go.
Actually, I don't know if that really matters at all. I just had to bring that up.
The bottom line is that these are two separate amendments out of 10 different ones that Barnett has proposed.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if we did pass the Repeal Amendment, as they're referring to it, that wouldn't enact the repealing of the income tax. However, whatever merits there might be to that idea, that's not what would happen. So,
Right.
Spitzer.
He clearly had a beef with that other one. He probably had the list of them in there. He's just like, I just can't not mention this one here. I have to bring it up. And because the guy's like, that's not even on the table right now.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
We're not even debating that.
It wasn't. If you look at the little thing on the bottom of the screen, it doesn't say anything about tax amendments. So, so Barnett corrects him on that, and Spitzer goes back to his beef with the other amendment that Barnett puts on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but let's come back just to the repeal amendment, because what I have heard from the more conservative side of the political aisle recently is that what business needs is certainty. What business needs is to understand what the laws are and what the tax rates will be, what the regulations will be. If you create this enormous question mark where states, after a bill has been passed, signed into law by the president, the states can then get together and at any time in the future repeal it, doesn't that, from your own political perspective, create the most massive uncertainty possible?
Well,
so wouldn't that be devastating?
So we're onto a term called uncertainty, which in our opinion is basically just the same idea as incoherency here.
Which is just a bunch of hogwash, basically.
It just means that he's concerned that the laws can be changed arbitrarily or repealed arbitrarily or whatever. And again, we have the Supreme Court, we have bureaucracy, we have presidential vetoes and everything. Just because Congress signed something into law doesn't mean that we're going to stick with it. It's just, in this case, it actually takes more work to get it repealed than some of the others or changed.
Yeah, I would say, especially the Supreme Court. I know you'd have to bring it up in some sort of a lawsuit or something like that, but to get it to the attention of the Supreme Court. But I think it would probably be equally, if not more, difficult to try to get 34 states to sign on to that. So
Exactly. And as far as the whole business needing certainty, again, it's just the same deal. I don't think that businesses are going to be upset by this if they can see that 34 states are actually going to go along with this. But I really like Barnett's response to the on the whole point about that Spitzer makes about business.
I'm not pro-business. That's not my thing. I'm pro-liberty. And the way we get liberty in this country, the way we've had liberty in this country, is by checks and balances. So I think I'd ask anybody who's considering this proposal just to ask themselves a question. Does this make the Constitution a better Constitution, or does it not make it a better Constitution?
Is this really a way, though, to repeal the health care bill? Isn't this really a vehicle for that? And why would you do that anyway, since we have 20 states arguing this, challenging?
Okay, so Parker brings up this point about 20 states that are filing lawsuits against the health care bill. Is she actually serious? Is she thinking about the proposal here? Because the amendment that Barnett has on the table here takes 34 states. And so assuming that it was actually in place, it wouldn't even be coming into effect now with only 20 states filing. We actually need a bigger plurality, in this case actually a majority, to enact this, to enact a repeal through this amendment rather than through any lawsuits that they're bringing up right now.
And the other thing too is if Obamacare or the health care bill is unconstitutional or it's a bad law, I mean, as she mentioned on there, it's something that is this a way to strike down health care, to get rid of health care? And he goes, yeah, it could be used for that. And so, I mean, it's just another check and balance in front of the
And
power.
is that a bad idea? I mean, if 34 states don't like healthcare or anything else, should we really be enacting this? I mean, if we get such a strong majority,
That's a pretty sizable number of states.
right? That's a lot more than, again, that's 20 states filing lawsuits. That's only 40% rather than 2/3 in this case. So I don't exactly see this as being a dangerous check on the federal government's ability to do anything.
Right. All right, and then he goes on to further discuss this in the next clip.
It could be used for that, but I think really what a lot of people amongst the general public now are very concerned about sort of runaway federal power. It actually started at the end of the Bush administration, and it continued in the beginning of the Obama administration. It's really made a lot of people upset, and I think rather than pass thou shalt not provisions in the Constitution that then have to rely on the courts to enforce, an internal structural checks and balance is the way we've done things in this country, and I don't see any reason why you can't trust the legislatures of 2/3 of the states to exercise their judgment as elected representatives
Go
of the
ahead,
people.
Eliot.
All right, so this system that Barnett's proposing it's proactive. It's not reactive. We can't. He's saying basically the courts, which are our check right now, they're not. They haven't been reliable in checking federal power in the legislature, and
He feels that his proposal is proactive, and is in that instead of, like Cal said, instead of waiting for the Supreme Court to strike down a law that people feel is unconstitutional, he thinks that the states would be better off to go through and try to strike down the law themselves by voting it by 2/3 majority.
right, and really it takes a lot of time for something to get in front of the Supreme Court. It can take years, even decades at times, and the Supreme Court doesn't review nearly as many laws as Congress passes every year. So there's no way that this can actually be a check, a review of everything. So this just it just gives us another power to look at anything that the Supreme Court might have missed, basically.
And this is the end of part 3. Two.
Part 2. We're going to be
sorry,
leading
yeah,
into
we're
part
going into
3.
part 3. That's right. Sorry, it's late. We're both tired, so we'll catch you in just a minute.